The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor of the Four Seasons ballroom, sending crystal fragments across polished shoes and designer gowns. In the sudden silence that followed, Dr. Amira Hassan stood frozen, her research presentation slides still glowing on the projection screen behind her, while 300 of Chicago's most influential donors stared at the mess spreading around her feet. "Perhaps," said the man who had caused her to drop the glass, his voice carrying easily across the hushed ballroom, "we should leave the science to people who actually understand it, rather than letting affirmative action hires play dress-up at serious events." Sheikh Omar al-Mansouri had spoken just loud enough for the front tables to hear, his words delivered with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. He sat back in his chair with satisfied smugness, clearly expecting appreciative chuckles from his fellow tech moguls. Instead, he found himself looking into the steady, unflinching gaze of a woman who had spent her entire career proving that brilliance came in forms his privilege had never taught him to recognize. Amira bent gracefully to collect the larger pieces of glass, her movements deliberate and unhurried despite the blood rushing in her ears. She had given this presentation on sustainable water purification technology dozens of times, to audiences ranging from Nobel laureates to village councils in rural Morocco. She had faced down skeptical investors, dismissive colleagues, and outright hostility from men who believed her hijab disqualified her from serious scientific discourse. But something about Omar's particular brand of entitled dismissal hit differently, perhaps because she had actually respected his work before this moment. "Thank you for that feedback," she said, straightening to face him directly. Her voice carried the slight accent that marked her as someone who had learned English as a second language, but every word was precisely chosen. "I'm curious about your expertise in water purification systems, since you seem confident enough to dismiss 3 years of peer-reviewed research in front of the Chicago Water Foundation's board of directors." Omar's expression shifted slightly. He had expected her to retreat, to apologize, to make herself smaller in the face of his public humiliation. Instead, she was looking at him with the kind of analytical attention she might give to a particularly interesting bacterial culture. "I don't need expertise in water purification to recognize when someone is out of their depth," he replied, doubling down with the instinct of a man who had never been forced to back down from a position. This foundation invests in proven solutions, not experimental pet projects from diversity initiatives." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Amira felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being reduced to a checkbox. Her decade of research and innovation dismissed as charity rather than merit. But she also felt something else, a cold, calculating anger that had sustained her through medical school in Casablanca, through her PhD at MIT, through every conference room where she had been the only woman, the only person of color, the only one whose presence was questioned before her mouth even opened. "You're absolutely right," she said, and Omar's eyebrows rose in surprise. "This foundation should invest in proven solutions, which is why I'm here presenting technology that has already provided clean water to 40,000 people across North Africa and is being implemented by the World Health Organization in refugee camps across 3 continents. She clicked to the next slide without looking away from his face. The screen filled with photographs, children drinking from wells that had been contaminated for generations, families filling containers from purification systems that looked like elegant sculptures rather than industrial machinery, communities that had been transformed by access to clean water. The technology uses bioengineered algae to neutralize heavy metals and bacterial contamination at a cost of 12 cents per 1,000 gallons. Amira continued, her voice gaining strength as she moved into the territory where she was unassailable. Traditional filtration systems cost 47 cents per 1,000 gallons and require infrastructure that most developing regions can't support. My system can be manufactured locally, using materials available in any region with basic industrial capacity. She clicked again. Charts and graphs filled the screen, showing efficiency rates, cost comparisons, environmental impact assessments, the kind of data that made venture capitalists salivate and humanitarian organizations weep with relief. The pilot program in Morocco reduced waterborne illness by 86% in participating communities. The system in Jordan has been running continuously for 18 months with minimal maintenance. The installation in Detroit's east side has provided clean water to 3,000 residents whose municipal supply was contaminated by industrial runoff. Detroit. The word landed like a small bomb in the room full of Chicago elite. This wasn't just about helping distant communities with exotic problems. This was about American cities, American families, American children who had been failed by systems that prioritized profit over public health. Omar's face had gone carefully blank, the expression of someone realizing he had made a significant miscalculation. Around the ballroom, conversations had stopped entirely. Board members were leaning forward, studying the data with the focused attention of people who recognized breakthrough technology when they saw it. "The Foundation's mission statement," Amira said, her voice now carrying to every corner of the silent room, "says that you exist to support innovative solutions that address water scarcity and contamination in underserved communities. My research does exactly that. The question isn't whether I belong in this room. The question is whether this foundation is serious about its stated mission, or whether it's more interested in maintaining comfortable assumptions about who gets to solve the world's problems." She closed her laptop with a decisive click. "I'll leave my contact information with Dr. Peterson. Thank you for your time." The silence that followed her exit was deafening. Omar sat frozen in his chair, acutely aware that 300 pairs of eyes were now focused on him, with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disgust. He had come to this fundraiser as one of the evening's honored guests, a tech mogul whose renewable energy investments had earned him recognition as one of Forbes' 30 under 30 social impact leaders. Now he felt like a child who had thrown a tantrum in front of adults who were suddenly seeing him clearly for the first time. Dr. Elizabeth Peterson, the foundation's director, approached his table with the measured steps of someone choosing her words very carefully. "Omar, I think we need to talk." The conversation that followed was brief and brutal. Dr. Peterson had known Omar since his graduate school days at Northwestern, had watched him build his renewable energy empire with genuine admiration for his vision and work ethic. But she had also watched him become increasingly isolated by his success, surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. "That woman," she said quietly, "has revolutionized water purification technology. Her work is going to save millions of lives, and you just dismissed her as a diversity hire in front of the most influential philanthropists in Chicago." Omar's stomach was churning with a combination of embarrassment and growing realization. "I didn't know about her research." "You didn't ask about her research. You saw a young woman in a hijab and made assumptions." Dr. Peterson's voice was disappointed rather than angry, which somehow made it worse. "Omar, I've known you for 8 years. You're brilliant, you're dedicated, and you've done incredible work in renewable energy. But tonight you sounded like every narrow-minded investor who ever told me that women couldn't understand complex technology." The comparison hit like a physical blow. Omar had built his career on proving that sustainable technology could be both profitable and transformative. He had fought against investors who dismissed renewable energy as impractical idealism, who believed that environmental consciousness was incompatible with serious business. He knew exactly what it felt like to have his work reduced to stereotypes and assumptions. "I need to apologize to her," he said, but Dr. Peterson was already shaking her head. "You need to do more than apologize. You need to understand why what you said was so damaging, and you need to figure out how to make it right." Omar left the fundraiser early, driving through Chicago's late-night streets with his mind churning. He had grown up in Dubai as the son of a successful businessman, educated at the best international schools, surrounded by wealth and opportunity that had made almost everything in his life feel achievable. He had worked hard, certainly, but he had never had to work against the kind of systematic dismissal that he had just witnessed himself perpetuating. The next morning, he found himself in an unusual position, researching someone else's work with the kind of desperate focus he usually reserved for his own projects. Dr. Amira Hassan's research was even more impressive than her presentation had suggested. Her water purification technology had been featured in Nature, Science, and the Journal of Environmental Engineering. She held patents in 12 countries and had been invited to present her work at the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and the Gates Foundation. But more than the accolades, Omar found himself drawn to the interviews and profiles that revealed the person behind the research. Amira had grown up in Casablanca, the daughter of a literature professor and a nurse, in a household where education was valued above all else but resources were limited. She had earned her undergraduate degree in biochemistry while working nights to help support her family, then won a full scholarship to MIT for graduate school. The transition to American academia had been brutal. Professors who questioned whether she could handle the rigor, classmates who assumed she was there to fill quotas rather than contribute to research, funding committees who suggested she focus on more appropriate areas of study. She had persevered through a combination of brilliance, stubbornness, and the kind of work ethic that came from knowing that failure meant not just personal disappointment, but letting down everyone who had sacrificed to make her education possible. Her research focus on water purification had emerged from personal experience. She had spent childhood summers with her grandmother in a rural village where clean water was a daily concern, where children missed school because of waterborne illnesses, where women spent hours each day walking to wells that might or might not provide safe drinking water. She had seen firsthand how access to clean water transformed communities, and she had dedicated her career to making that transformation scalable and sustainable. Omar closed his laptop and stared out the window of his downtown Chicago office, watching Lake Michigan stretch toward the horizon. His own path to success suddenly felt embarrassingly straightforward in comparison. He had identified a market opportunity in renewable energy, raised capital from family connections, and built a business that was both profitable and beneficial to the environment. Important work, certainly, but work that had been supported and encouraged at every step. He had never had to prove that he belonged in boardrooms or justify his presence at investor meetings. He had never had his accent analyzed for signs of intelligence or his appearance scrutinized for evidence of seriousness. He had never had to choose between honoring his cultural identity and being taken seriously in professional settings. The realization was uncomfortable and necessary. Omar had always considered himself progressive, supportive of diversity and inclusion in abstract terms. But abstract support was different from understanding the daily reality of navigating systems designed to exclude you, and it was certainly different from actively working to change those systems. His assistant knocked on his door, interrupting his brooding. "Mr. Al-Mansouri, Dr. Hassan is here to see you." Omar's heart rate spiked. He had been planning to reach out to her, but he hadn't expected her to come to him. "Send her in." Amira entered his office with the same composed confidence she had shown at the fundraiser, but Omar could see the wariness in her eyes. She was dressed professionally but not formally, in a navy blazer and matching hijab that somehow made his expensive suit feel like a costume. "Dr. Hassan, thank you for coming. Please, sit down." She remained standing. "I'm not here for an apology, if that's what you're thinking. I'm here because Dr. Peterson suggested that you might be interested in actually learning about my research, rather than dismissing it based on assumptions." The directness of her approach caught him off guard. He had expected to control the conversation, to manage the interaction on his terms. Instead, she was setting the parameters with the confidence of someone who had nothing to lose. "You're right to be angry," he said. "What I said last night was inexcusable. It wasn't just what you said. It was the assumption behind it, that my presence in that room was somehow illegitimate, that my research was less valuable because of who I am rather than what I've accomplished." Omar nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I've spent the morning reading about your work. It's extraordinary. The efficiency rates, the cost reduction, the environmental impact. This technology could change everything." "Could change everything," Amira repeated, "but only if it gets the support it needs to scale. Only if foundations like Dr. Peterson's invest in implementation rather than just research. Only if people like you stop seeing diversity as a threat to excellence and start recognizing it as essential to innovation." She moved to the window, looking out at the lake. "Do you know why I focus on water purification rather than more lucrative areas of biochemistry?" Omar shook his head, though he suspected he was about to learn something important. "Because clean water is the foundation of everything else. Education, economic development, public health, community stability. You can't build sustainable societies without it. But the communities that need this technology most are also the communities that traditional investors ignore because they don't represent obvious profit opportunities." She turned back to face him. "Your renewable energy work is impressive. You've built systems that make environmental sustainability profitable for wealthy countries and corporations. But what about communities that can't afford your solutions? What about regions where the infrastructure for large-scale renewable energy doesn't exist?" The question hit harder than Omar had expected. His renewable energy projects were indeed focused on markets that could afford premium pricing for environmental benefits. Wealthy countries, large corporations, institutions with significant capital budgets. He had told himself that success in these markets would eventually drive costs down enough to benefit everyone. but he had never seriously considered how to make his technology accessible to communities that needed it most. "I've been thinking about that problem," he admitted, "but I haven't found a sustainable business model that addresses it." "Because you're thinking like a businessman instead of thinking like an engineer." Amira's voice carried a hint of challenge. What if the goal wasn't maximum profit but maximum impact? What if success was measured by lives improved rather than returns generated? That's not how venture capital works. Then maybe venture capital isn't the right funding model for every problem worth solving. The conversation continued for 2 hours, ranging across topics from technology development to social impact investing, to the cultural barriers that prevented innovation from reaching the communities that needed it most. Omar found himself energized by Amira's perspective in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Her approach to problem-solving was both more idealistic and more practical than his own, focused on systemic change rather than incremental improvement. By the time she left his office, Omar had made a decision that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. He was going to fund her research, not as a charitable gesture but as a genuine partnership. More than that, he was going to restructure his own business model to prioritize impact alongside profit, to use his success in wealthy markets to subsidize access in underserved communities. The partnership that emerged over the following months was unlike anything either of them had experienced. Omar brought capital, business expertise, and connections to manufacturing networks. Amira brought revolutionary technology, deep understanding of community needs, and the kind of credibility that came from years of working directly with the people her innovations were designed to serve. Their first joint project was a water purification installation in Flint, Michigan, where the municipal water crisis had left thousands of residents without reliable access to clean drinking water. The system they designed was elegant in its simplicity. Modular units that could be manufactured locally, maintained by community members with basic training, and powered by solar panels that Omar's company provided at cost. The installation process became a model for community engagement. Rather than imposing solutions from outside, they worked with local residents to understand specific needs and constraints. They hired locally for manufacturing and maintenance jobs, providing training that transferred to other employment opportunities. They partnered with community organizations to ensure that the technology served everyone, not just those who could afford to pay. The success in Flint led to projects in Detroit, Newark, and rural communities across Appalachia where industrial contamination had made traditional water sources unsafe. Each installation was adapted to local conditions and needs, but the underlying approach remained consistent: technology designed for sustainability, implementation focused on community empowerment, funding structured to prioritize access over profit. Omar found himself traveling more than he had in years, spending time in communities that his previous business model had never touched. The experience was transformative in ways he hadn't anticipated. In rural Kentucky, he met families who had been buying bottled water for drinking and cooking because their well water was contaminated by coal mining runoff. In Newark, he worked with community activists who had been fighting for clean water access for decades, learning about the intersection of environmental justice and racial equity. The work was harder than anything he had done before, but it was also more meaningful. Instead of optimizing profit margins and market share, he was measuring success in terms of children who no longer missed school due to waterborne illness, families who could afford groceries because they weren't spending hundreds of dollars monthly on bottled water, communities that had gained both clean water and the technical skills to maintain their own systems. Amira was an extraordinary partner, bringing not just technical expertise but a deep understanding of how to navigate cultural and linguistic barriers that Omar had never had to consider. She could explain complex biochemistry to community groups in terms that made sense to people without scientific training. She could identify local leaders who would be effective advocates for new technology. She could adapt implementation strategies to work within existing social structures rather than disrupting them. But more than her professional skills, Omar found himself drawn to her perspective on success and responsibility. She had grown up with less material privilege than he had, but she had also grown up with a clearer sense of obligation to use her talents for community benefit. Her research wasn't just about personal achievement or professional recognition. It was about solving problems that affected real people in immediate, tangible ways. The attraction between them developed gradually, built on mutual respect and shared commitment rather than superficial chemistry. Omar had dated plenty of women who were impressed by his wealth and status, but he had never been with someone who challenged him to be better than he thought he could be. Amira saw through his carefully constructed public persona to the person underneath, someone who was genuinely committed to making a positive impact, but who had been limited by the narrow definition of success he had inherited. Their relationship deepened during a project installation in Phoenix, where they were working with a Navajo community to establish water purification systems on reservation land. The work was technically challenging, requiring adaptation of Amira's technology to work with high mineral content in the local groundwater, but it was also culturally complex, requiring sensitivity to tribal sovereignty and traditional relationships with natural resources. Omar had never worked in contexts where his usual approach to business relationships was not just ineffective, but actively counterproductive. He couldn't simply write checks and expect results. He had to build trust, demonstrate respect for community priorities, and accept that his role was to support rather than lead. Amira guided him through the process with patience that he probably didn't deserve. She had experience working with indigenous communities in Morocco and understood the importance of approaching such partnerships with humility rather than assumptions about what communities needed or wanted. "This isn't about saving people," she explained one evening as they reviewed installation plans in their shared hotel room. "It's about providing tools that communities can use to solve their own problems. The difference matters." Omar was beginning to understand that the difference mattered in all of their work, not just in culturally sensitive contexts. His previous approach to business had been based on identifying problems and imposing solutions, using capital and expertise to drive change from the top down. But sustainable change, he was learning, required community ownership and local capacity building. The Phoenix project was completed successfully, providing clean water access to 800 people while creating 12 permanent jobs in system maintenance and manufacturing support. But more importantly for Omar, it marked a fundamental shift in how he understood his role as an investor and entrepreneur. 6 months later, he proposed to Amira during a site visit to their latest project in rural Alabama, where they had just completed installation of water purification systems serving 6 communities that had been without reliable clean water for decades. The proposal was characteristically practical. He suggested that they formalize their partnership not just professionally, but personally, combining their resources and expertise to maximize their impact. Amira's response was characteristically direct. She would marry him if he could prove that he understood the difference between charity and justice, between helping people and empowering them to help themselves. The conversation that followed lasted until dawn, covering everything from family expectations to career priorities to the practical challenges of building a life together across cultural and economic differences. By the time the sun rose over the Alabama countryside, they had outlined not just a marriage but a shared mission that would guide the rest of their lives. Their wedding took place in Chicago, in the community center of a neighborhood where one of their first water purification systems had been installed. The guest list included Nobel laureates and community activists, venture capitalists and social workers, family members from Dubai and Casablanca and everywhere in between. The ceremony itself blended traditions from both their backgrounds, but the focus was on their commitment to using their partnership as a foundation for continued service. Dr. Peterson, who had introduced them in the most uncomfortable way possible, gave a toast that captured the transformation she had witnessed. Omar and Amira have shown us that the most powerful innovations come not from individual brilliance, but from the collision of different perspectives, different experiences, different ways of understanding the world's problems. Their work together has been more impactful than anything either of them could have accomplished alone. 5 years later, their joint foundation had provided clean water access to over 2 million people across 4 continents. The technology they had developed together was being manufactured in 17 countries, creating thousands of jobs while driving down costs through local production. Their model of community-centered implementation had been adopted by major international development organizations and was being taught in business schools as an example of sustainable social entrepreneurship. But Omar's proudest achievement wasn't measured in people served or systems installed. It was the moment, during a project review meeting in Detroit, when a community leader who had been skeptical of their work from the beginning stood up and said, "These folks didn't come here to save us. They came here to work with us." And that made all the difference. The comment reminded Omar of his grandmother's advice, shared during his childhood in Dubai. True success is not what you accumulate for yourself, but what you make possible for others. He had spent years misunderstanding that wisdom, thinking it meant charitable giving or philanthropic gestures. Now he understood that it meant something much more challenging and much more rewarding, using his privileges and resources to create opportunities for others to succeed on their own terms. If stories about the power of partnership and community-centered innovation resonate with you, consider supporting organizations in your own community that work to address basic needs like clean water, affordable housing, or educational access. Sometimes the most transformative changes begin with recognizing that everyone has something valuable to contribute, and that real solutions emerge when different perspectives work together toward shared goals.